Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our first of three webinars for the Science Votes the Future AGU's Get Out the Vote initiative, teaching you how to engage in elections safely with the help of our very own friend and lawyer from the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. I'm Caitlin Bergstrom. I'm the program manager for AGU's Science Policy and Government Relations team and the manager of the Science Votes for the Future program. Today, we have Chris from Climate Science Legal Defense Fund who's going to talk a little bit more about what your rights are as a scientist, what you can and can't do in an election year, and he'll be available to to answer any questions that folks might have. This webinar is being recorded, so if you do have any questions that you think might be more confidential, please reserve them for shooting Chris an email afterwards. But I think a lot of questions that folks have are questions that other people have, so it would be great if you have one you think is a common question to share with this group and then on the recording after this. So I will turn it over to Chris so he can start with his presentation.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's a privilege to be here. Let me just share my screen. 1 second. All right. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Chris Marchesano. I'm a staff attorney at the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. We're a nonprofit. We're based in New York, and we provide a host of services for scientists or academics or researchers who are facing censorship or retaliation or harassment because of their work. We offer everything from traditional legal representation to defamation checks to educational offerings like this today. So we're here today to provide you with a rough outline of your First Amendment rights as a scientist and the general limits of your political speech and advocacy. The fact is, there's an increasing number of scientists who are taking proactive roles in activism, and it's typically, historically, not been the case. Scientists aren't known to be rabble-rousers or typically out into street marching, but we are facing serious existential threats, and scientists in many cases have been the canary in the coal mine here regarding these issues. So before we begin, why are scientists engaging in advocacy and activism? There's a lot of reasons. Obviously, we're still feeling, and we will continue to feel the effects of climate change across the world. We are also affected nationally with a Congress and with leaders who are disproportionately non-believers in climate change and are science skeptics. One recent study had about 23%, over 100 members of Congress who do not believe in man-made climate change. So that's a major issue. And another serious concern for scientists right now is the number one question I get asked all the time, and that's about the potential return of Schedule F. Schedule F was an executive order from the previous administration that, by and large, would have transformed tens of thousands of federal civil service jobs, like federal scientists, into political appointments, which meant they could be fired or just far less civil service protections, and it's very worrying. So it's something that's been on a lot of your minds. So we've seen a lot of scientists in response become active, engage in lobbying, engage in political advocacy. So my goal today is to provide you just with a little bit of background and a rough understanding of how you can go about and do so safely, both personally and professionally. And to do that, let's start with campaigning for a science-forward candidate of your choosing. What are the guidelines there? And to do so, we have to talk about the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act is a federal law. It's been around for well over 100 years. It was passed during another politically divisive time in this country during the FDR administration. And the Hatch Act has a bunch of aims and goals. And the first one is to protect federal employees from political coercion within the workplace. Right? During the New Deal, a lot of federal civil servants were only getting promoted if they supported the New Deal. That's no way to run the civil service. So it's meant to protect employees within the workplace. It also, sort of the opposite side of the coin, ensures that federal employees are advanced based on merit and not political affiliation. And it lays out the ground rules for your political expression outside of work. So it sort of enshrines your rights to be engaged in advocacy or activism outside of your job as a federal employee. So who does it cover? It covers all employees of the federal government, like agency scientists. It also covers some state, DC, and local government officials. And it has been expanded over the years to also cover scientists who work with federally funded programs or who receive federal funds. Now, to understand the Hatch Act, you'll have to understand that scientists and workers fall into two basic levels. I'll cover them briefly, but only one will be applicable to you. So there are two separate restriction levels. One restriction level is for more restricted employees, and these are individuals involved in law enforcement, in the FBI, CIA, NSA. They're also individuals who are working for election integrity bodies, and they are severely restricted in what they can do outside of work, definitely inside of work, but also outside of work when it comes to engaging in political speech or advocacy or activism. For these people, they are prohibited from volunteering or working for political campaigns, canvassing for an opponent, serving as an officer in a political organization, and they're even restricted from endorsing or opposing a political candidate publicly. Everyone else here, all scientists, I'm assuming, will fall into the less restricted category. And this would include all federal employees, like I said, and scientists working with federal funds. And there's sort of a golden rule for less restricted employees. And that is that you are not allowed to engage in political activity or political expression while on duty. And we'll talk about that a couple of times. But for right now, the definition of on duty will be broadly explained as being on the clock, so being at your work desk during the work day, being in a federal building, or being in a work vehicle. We'll expand on that in a little bit. So what are you guys allowed to do in terms of political expression, political speech, as a less restricted employee? Like I said, most scientists will fit under this umbrella, and you have a lot of rights here. You're allowed to, outside of work, volunteer for a political campaign. You're allowed to canvass for a political candidate. You can serve as a poll worker. I actually just did my training for a poll worker up in the Hudson Valley this week. It's pretty rewarding. I didn't know if it would be, but it's worth getting involved. You're allowed to display buttons or stickers which endorse a political candidate. You could publicly endorse or oppose a candidate online, in person, writing op-eds, as long as it's outside of work and you use disclaimers. You can go to marches or rallies. You can speak at protests or conventions, and you could utilize your own private social media to express your political opinions. Now, I want to give also a great recent example of someone who is expertly navigating the Hatch Act on a level that you guys will never have to deal with. But that person is Pete Buttigieg. He is the U.S. Secretary of Transportation in the Biden administration. But he's also been one of the top, if not the premier surrogate for the Harris campaign for presidency. And he was actually the first person out there once Harris took that nomination on all these news channels, doing interviews, going on Fox News even. And he's been forced to do this, to serve as a surrogate as a private citizen. And as he's done media rounds, you'll hear him discuss the election, and you'll hear him discuss both candidates, but you will never hear him discuss his work as the Secretary of Transportation or use this opportunity to discuss his role in the Biden administration. So the general rule is you could either talk about partisan politics or you could talk about your federal job. It's sort of an either or. And there was actually a great interview in mid-July with the New York Times where he was being interviewed and he was campaigning for Harris as a surrogate. And he was asked a question about his work working with President Biden. And I think it was about his mental acuity or some policy goal. And he actually stopped the interview and he cited the Hatch Act. And he said, I can't talk about this. I'm in here as a private citizen. I'm here as a former presidential candidate. but I'm not here as a member of the Biden administration. And after this interview, he is not even introduced in interviews. You'll realize as the department head for the Department of Transportation. He's introduced as the former mayor of South Bend. So he's drawn a very clear delineation, a very clear line between his private life and his involvement in partisan politics and his work as a federal employee. Like I said, he's a very extreme example. Most of you will never have to walk this tightrope, but it's actually a very useful example to show because it makes it quite clear, I think. So what are best practices? So you don't get wrapped up in violating the Hatch Act. Keep track and document your work hours. So make sure you're not involving in any political advocacy while you're on the clock. It was easier when we were all in offices 5 days a week. It's a little bit trickier in a post-pandemic world, but try to be diligent with this. Obviously, don't use any work computers or work phones for any personal or political activity. This is a big one. Please keep separate social media accounts. So if you have access to your work, not only email, but Twitter account or Instagram, please keep all politics stuff off that account. Just utilize your private accounts for that. And obviously, do not use grant money for any political activity. This does not include your salary. Once those federal funds are distilled down or passed through into your salary, that is your private funds, and you can donate to a campaign or a candidate as you're choosing. If you do go and if you do some on-ground campaigning, you want to knock on doors during the day or you want to attend a march, please take personal or vacation days from work to attend these events. And once again, the general rule is you are not allowed to engage in partisan political speech or political expression while on duty. And that means being on the clock, being in a federal building, or being in a work vehicle. Next, I want to talk about is just if you choose to engage in any sort of activism or advocacy that's on the ground. So this is going to rallies, marches, or collective action. So let's create a hard line first for protesting, and we'll build off the best practices. Like I said, no work vehicle. Do not drive to any protest or rally in a vehicle given to you by your employer, but also try not to wear any work paraphernalia. So no shirts with agency emblems, no university logos, no lab coats that actually have brands on them. I know a lot of scientists go to these marches with lab coats, but they aren't branded with their employer. And the number one thing you need to know is just please obey all content neutral restrictions. These are the time, place, location restrictions that are standard in any protest or any march or any rally. And that includes things like keeping bike lanes open, obeying traffic laws, not violating noise ordinances, and maintaining a peaceful protesting environment. And one thing I will say also is if you're interested in on-the-ground advocacy, taking a nonviolent direct action course, which I've also done this year, was incredibly useful for providing like safe ground rules and methods for engaging in this type of activism. There's a lot of great organizations that conduct these things, and I can't speak more highly about going to one and getting educated that way. So now that we understand a little bit about our rights in terms of workplace employment and federal employment or working with federal funds and political speech, let's talk about understanding your First Amendment rights. So for our purposes here today, let's make it clear that the First Amendment mandates that you have the right to peaceful protest and to attend demonstrations in support of political and non-political issues. So for our purposes, the First Amendment protects public employees who speak in their private capacities about matters that concern the public, and the speech does not unduly interfere with your job. We're going to break this definition down, but I just want to say before we do that if you're in the private sector, you still can get reprimanded by your employer for you don't have the same free speech rights as someone working as a public employee or a federal employee. Private employers may have different in-house rules and regulations, and we'll cover that later on. So let's break this down. So right now, let's define public employees. Public employees work for the federal, state, or DC government. They work for cities, municipalities, township, counties, or similar smaller level governments. And also, if you are an academic or a scientist working for a state university, you are working for a publicly funded institution, and you are considered a state employee and therefore a public employee. So that would account for you as well. So let's break down this definition by talking about two very brief cases. The standard for First Amendment protections for public employees is called the Pickering-Connick test, and it involved two cases that basically created this general rule. And the first case was called Pickering versus the Board of Education. It took place back in the 60s. And essentially, a high school teacher, public high school, was fired for writing a letter to the local paper where he criticized the school board and the school for funneling more funds, I believe it was into sporting programs than academics. The school board, his superiors found out about this letter in the newspaper, this op-ed that was published, and he was fired. He contested his termination, and the school board alleged at the time that the letter was, quote, detrimental to the interest of the school. It went through the court system. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court at the time, and the Supreme Court found that Pickering's First Amendment rights were violated. They held that a public employee does, and I'll give you a quote, does not relinquish their right to speak out on matters of public concern simply because they have accepted government employment. Right? So we already know what defines a public employee. So now let's define what a matter of public concern is. There's pretty wide latitude here. A matter of public concern is a matter of any political, social, or other community importance. So huge, huge latitude here. So climate change, any government policy, scientific integrity, political stances, this would all be covered within this definition. So you don't need to worry about that. The second test, the second prong of this Pickering-Connick test for understanding your First Amendment rights comes from a case in the early 80s, and that case was called Connick v. Myers. And it sort of clarified the position a bit and then added a second prong to this test. Just as a little background, this case takes place down in New Orleans in the district attorney's office. There was an assistant district attorney who was told that she was going to be transferred positions into another job, and she objected to the transfer. So what she decided to do was to go home and to write out a lengthy survey about questions about the office, about whether people thought the office was poorly run, about office morale, whether other employees agreed with the transfer policy, asking her coworkers if they were confident in the leadership at the office. She writes the survey, she prints out several copies, and she distributes them throughout the office. She was fired because, one, she refused to transfer, but also because she sent out this questionnaire, which created a whole uproar in her office. She sues for wrongful termination. It goes through the courts, and just like Pickering, it ends up at the Supreme Court. In a split decision, the Supreme Court actually upheld her termination, right? So, specifically, the court found that the questionnaire that she distributed focused on internal office workings that did not touch on matters of public concern. Right? So office morale, competence in leadership, these aren't matters of public concern. These are small grievances. So it clarified that internal or petty grievances are not matters of public concern. So it sort of crystallized that first prong. But the court also, like I said before, added another prong. And that prong is to weigh whether the behavior or free expression or free speech that is being alleged unduly disrupts the workplace. And the court noted that these government officials in the DA's office still should enjoy wide latitude in managing their offices. They're still operating off taxpayer money, and they maintain an interest in having a disruptive free workforce. So they instituted a balancing metric here. And much like the first prong, it's usually pretty favorable to the person alleging a First Amendment violation. It's pretty wide latitude given. So Connick's speech, this ADA speech, was not related to a matter of public concern. And it was also, in this case, found to have sparked a mini insurrection. That was an actual quote within the office, which affected the district attorney's office ability to function, the ability to work, the ability to serve the public, and therefore her termination was warranted. So this sort of clarifies another prong, which states that free speech or expression should not unduly interfere with your job. And a lot of our best practices that we've discussed, a lot of our best practices that I'll discuss on the next webinar regarding not falling afoul of lobbying restrictions will sort of augment this stance. Basically, keeping your work and private life separate, doing things off the clock, using disclaimers if you're going to go out in public and share your opinions. They revolve around this sentiment. Basically, your advocacy and your activism and your free speech should not completely dominate or disrupt your workplace. So now that this test is sort of crystallized and clear, we at CSLDF also advise clients to engage in advocacy outside of their official capacity. This is a sort of recent decision, and it's not part of the Pickering-Connick test, but it's part of the overall testing of First Amendment speech. And there was a case called Garcetti v. Ceballos, which is very convoluted that I won't go into. But essentially, the takeaway is, along with not unduly affecting your workplace and talking on matters of public concern, do not speak or protest or engage in advocacy in your official capacity as a public employee. So when I mentioned before about using a disclaimer, if you're going to write an op-ed or put a post on Twitter, it's perfectly fine for you to say, these are my credentials, this is my employer, but use a disclaimer, right? You could refer to your expertise, but ensure that you are speaking or advocating outside of your job and not as part of a job function or a work responsibility. I want to talk briefly, like I mentioned before, about what your First Amendment rights are in terms of private employment, if you are privately employed. And you have pretty significant protections as a public employee. Unfortunately, you have less First Amendment protections if you're employed within the private sector. A public employer can't muzzle its employees or penalize them for their expressions or associations to the same extent that a private employer can. And obviously, all private employers, they're subject to anti-discrimination laws, retaliation laws, whistleblower laws. However, there isn't an enshrined protected free speech right. In every state in this country, except for Montana, there is at-will employment laws, which sort of allows for this latitude. And my favorite case, the one I've been talking about for years involving this, involves a woman named Julie Briskman. And Julie was employed several years ago. Yeah, I think it was a Virginia-based federal contractor. So she was working for a private employer. She was riding her bike home outside of work. And as she was passing a golf course, the former president's motorcade came out of the golf course and passed her, and she decided to flip off the motorcade, which was captured in this photo. And this is a unique act of political expression. This photo sort of took off and became iconic. She actually posted this photo on her social media, and she alerted her superiors in her private employment that the photo was going viral, and ultimately she was fired because of this. Her employer claimed that she had violated a company rule that barred her from posting lewd or obscene postings on social media. I'm sure they were also concerned about their ability to get government contracts with this sort of thing happening in their employer base. But obviously, she sued for wrongful termination, and her case was dismissed at the trial level. The court held that because she was a private employee and because she was an at-will employee, her company was within its rights to terminate her based on her conduct and based on their own unique workplace rules. And this is deeply ironic because she would actually have had better employment protections if she worked for the Trump administration at the time, because what she engaged in was an act of political expression, and it was outside of work, and she was doing it within her realm as a private citizen. Ultimately, for Ms. Briskman, she utilized this to get involved in local politics. She knocked off an incumbent, I believe it was district supervisor. So there's actually a happy ending to this. But just know that if you're working for a private employer, you don't have the same breadth of protections, First Amendment protections, as a public employee does. So this is a very short webinar. We'll have more on similar topics in the next couple of weeks, but Until then, I would also recommend that everyone check out our website. We have pocket guides that are phenomenal that cover a huge range of topics, including your First Amendment rights, not running afoul of the Hatch Act, how to participate in the rule and note making process. There's a whole bunch of different guides which are super useful. And like I said before, and like Caitlin said before, if you have any questions that are personal, please feel free to email us at CSLDF and we could talk about it, set up a meeting. If there's any questions suitable for public now, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Chris. I feel like I always learn so much from this presentation, and I've seen it like 3 times. We have a couple questions in the chat, and then I'll let folks come off chat if they have them. Andrea asked why you're not allowed to wear a university logo at a protest. Is it because they often receive federal funds?
Yeah, so there's no like hard rule on this, but yes, it's because they receive federal funds. And we have also seen in the past a lot of bad faith actors, um, these groups that work for the oil and gas industry, bad faith actors in Congress, target scientists through predatory FOIA requests and document requests through their universities. So it just for your own protection and for the protection of your employer, if you're working with a new university, it just makes a lot more sense to engage in advocacy or activism without tying yourself to your university. Obviously, like I said before, if you're writing an op-ed, you can certainly make an appeal to your experience, your expertise, but it's the clearer the line between your private life and your work life, the better generally.
Great, thank you. Reggie asks, you mentioned at-will employment affecting everyone but Montana, and Reggie lives in Montana, so they'd like to know what's the difference between not having at-will employment in
So
Montana.
Montana is a fascinating case. You wouldn't expect it, but Montana actually has they have protections for workers. It's not simply at will. There has to be a reason, and there's a list of reasons why a person can be employed. There's more worker protections in Montana. This has proved sort of a double-edged sword because one of our clients is in Montana, is an academic. And while there are some sort of built-in, baked-in protections for workers, the tangible effect on the ground is that Montana has a almost no unions. They have a much lower union rate within both the academic sphere and the general worker population as well. So you find people who, even though they have some protections built into their legislation, they actually don't have union protections. So employers can work to get rid of an employee over a period of time. They just can't fire them at will. But we've unfortunately seen that within higher education in Montana, there have been some public universities that have sort of a campaign of weeding people out over time, sort of abiding by the law, but having a very a very plain plan on getting rid of employees working for the public university. So I don't know why it's Montana, but it is Montana, unfortunately.
Fascinating. Very interesting to know. If anyone else has other questions, you can feel free to drop them in the chat or come off mute. I have a couple of questions I think would be helpful for Chris to answer because I think they're questions we often get around this kind of thing. So I think a lot of our members and folks in the AGU community are graduate students or working at a university with, say, an NSF grant or a NASA grant. So I know you talked a little about this, but Hatch Act, some of these Hatch Act things apply to them still, correct? Even though they're maybe employed by a university, but they receive money from the federal government.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, usually the verbiage of the Hatch Act is built into the grant itself or the
Mm,
application of federal funds. So if you are working with federal funds, or the institution you're working with has federal funds, you will also be subject to Hatch Act protections and restrictions as well.
okay. Another question I think that has come up before is if you are like attending a conference or traveling on government funds, either as a government employee, even if you're not on the clock necessarily, but if the government paid for you to take a trip, what does that look like?
That's a great question, Caitlin, and one that we get a bunch. We often get this with people, scientists who want to do some lobbying, which could just simply mean visiting with their congressperson or their representative at home. And a lot of times, a lot of these conferences will happen in DC. So you'll have federal funds that are being used to go to a conference for their expertise. And then they say, I'm going to peel off for a little bit while I'm in DC and talk to my congressperson. If you're going to do that, you sort of have to carve out time, whether it's staying an extra night in DC and using funds to pay for your hotel to meet with that congressperson, but you can't miss part of your conference or part of the event that you're being sent there with federal funds to do something like lobbying or to do something like engaging in a protest or a march or engaging in political expression. So much like the general rule of keeping things off duty, if you are using federal funds to get somewhere and you want to augment that trip with some sort of political expression or some sort of lobbying, please utilize your own funds and make sure that it's on, on the hours where you're not on the clock or you're not obligated to be somewhere.
Great, thanks, Chris. Any other questions from our audience here? Folks are free to come off mute. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again with some contact info. So if anyone has private questions for Chris, oops, I think I didn't share there.
Okay, I could put my email in the chat, actually.
Yeah, it's lawyer@csldf.org, right?
Yep, that's the general one. That'll go to our little team of staff attorneys.
Perfect. And if you have any other questions for our team, you can email us at sciencepolicy.edu.org. But if you want to drop your email in the chat, Chris, that would be great. We do have 2 other webinars in this series. On October 10th, we are going to be hosting Science Rising to talk about countering election disinformation and misinformation. I know I always forget the difference between the two, so making sure that you are understanding how to get correct information around the elections, mis and disinformation, and how to help others do the same. So I think that'll be a really great conversation. It's going to be at the same time from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. And then after the election, Chris and I believe his colleague Lauren are going to be coming back to join us again to talk about scientific advocacy with Congress and administrative agencies. So hopefully we'll know the results of the election by then, and we can have a better idea of what kind of Congress we're going to be interacting with and what kind of administration we're going to be interacting with. But I know Liz is going to drop the registration for those in the chat, so folks can add those. You can find this information too at our website, sciencevotesthefuture.org. That webinar information is going to be right at the top of the page, along with our elections pledge if you haven't signed that, and more information on checking your voter registration, making sure you're registered to vote, looking up your polling place, and looking up information on your candidates. I will leave with the emails on here, but I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you all at some of our future presentations.